Leonardo da Vinci was never merely a painter. He was a confrontation with human limitation itself. His life forces a brutal question upon us. Is a human being meant to complete tasks or to pursue truth so relentlessly that no fixed identity can contain him? Most people remember the masterpieces. That is the shallow reading. The deeper truth is harder. Leonardo did not simply create beauty. He stripped the world down to its hidden structure. He looked at flesh, water, machines, shadows, motion, and asked the same ruthless question each time. What is this beneath appearance? That question made him dangerous. It also made him timeless. Long before the modern world praised innovation, interdisciplinarity, and the restless mind, Leonardo was already living beyond the borders of his century. When the world still divided art from science, hand from mind, beauty from knowledge, he had already seen that these divisions were false. For him, painting was not decoration, it was inquiry. Observation was not passive. It was a form of intellectual courage. To look deeply was to resist illusion. And that is why Leonardo still unsettles us in 2025. Modern people celebrate productivity, titles, and finished results. Leonardo reveals a harsher truth. A great life may not be the life that fits neatly into one profession. It may be the life that refuses confinement. It may be the life that remains unfinished precisely because it reaches too far. In him, genius is not comfort. It is hunger. It is tension. It is the refusal to stop at the surface. So, to understand Leonardo is not simply to admire an extraordinary man. It is to face a deeper human problem. What happens when the desire to know becomes stronger than the desire to belong, to finish, or even to be understood? That is the question that opens his life. And it is exactly where the deeper body of this reflection must begin. Chapter 1. The beginning from a marginal existence. A human being is often forged not at the center of order, but at the edge of rejection. Leonardo da Vinci did not begin life as a crowned genius. He began as a fracture. He entered the world marked by incompletion, born outside the clean legitimacy that society respected, and that fact matters more than people want to admit. Greatness rarely rises from comfort. It rises from tension. It rises from the wound that refuses to close. Before the modern world began praising individuality, before people turned difference into a slogan, Leonardo was already living the raw truth of it. He stood outside the secure structure of inherited identity. He was not born into the full social wholeness that Renaissance society rewarded. He was not the obvious heir to a stable name, a fixed role, a protected future. From the beginning, existence placed him near the threshold rather than inside the house. That is not a sentimental detail. That is a philosophical origin. Because the one who is denied easy belonging is often forced to ask the question others never ask. Who am I when no system fully claims me? This is where the real journey begins. Not in talent, not in fame, in estrangement. A child who stands slightly outside the accepted pattern learns early that identity is not something simply given. It must be confronted. It must be built. It must be wrestled out of silence. Most people inherit a place and then spend their lives decorating it. Leonardo inherited uncertainty and had to turn uncertainty into inner architecture. That is why his life cannot be read only as the story of a brilliant artist. It must be read as the story of consciousness, refusing the prison of assigned limits. Society always pretends its hierarchies are natural. They are not. They are acts of collective fear. Every rigid order tries to decide in advance who belongs, who speaks, who deserves, who remains small. Renaissance Italy, for all its beauty, was no exception. It produced art, power, prestige, and refinement, but it also enforced lines. Birth mattered. Legitimacy mattered. Social clarity mattered. A person's beginning could become a verdict. Leonardo emerged under that verdict. He was touched by the logic of exclusion before he was touched by the language of glory. But exclusion does something strange to a powerful mind. It can break it, or it can strip away illusion. For Leonardo, it seems to have done the second. The child who cannot fully rest inside convention often becomes the adult who sees convention for what it is, a mask pretending to be truth. That distance becomes vision. That wound becomes method. When you are not fully absorbed by the order around you, you begin to observe it instead of obeying it. You notice its absurdity. You notice its fragility. You notice that what others call destiny is often just repetition protected by fear. This is why marginality can become a hidden form of freedom, not comfortable freedom, not romantic freedom. A harder freedom, the freedom of not being fully owned by the script, the freedom of inner movement, the freedom born when the soul realizes that if it will never be perfectly embraced by the structure, then it no longer needs to worship the structure. Leonardo's later restlessness, his refusal to remain inside one discipline, one method, one intellectual border, did not appear from nowhere. It had roots in this early condition. His life began in an unstable place, and from that instability, he learned not to kneel before categories. Here, the modern reader must confront an uncomfortable truth. People like to believe freedom comes after acceptance. It often does not. Acceptance can make the self soft. It can make the mind obedient. It can make a person confuse belonging with truth. But the one who has already felt the cold edge of non-belonging may discover something deeper. He may discover that identity is not validated by the crowd. He may discover that meaning is not handed down by institutions. He may discover that the soul grows strongest where external certainty collapses. This is not an argument for suffering as spectacle. It is an argument about what suffering reveals. Human beings do not merely fear pain, they fear groundlessness. They fear the moment when no clear answer tells them who they are. They fear being unclassified, unconfirmed, undefined. That fear still rules people now. The modern world speaks constantly of self-expression, yet most people remain terrified of stepping outside approved forms. They want freedom, but only freedom that keeps them admired. They want uniqueness, but only uniqueness that still fits the market, the tribe, the image, the expected script. Modernity has not solved the problem of identity. It has only made the masks more polished. This is why Leonardo still matters in 2025 and beyond, not because he was simply talented, but because he reveals a structure of existence that has not changed. The individual is still born into systems that try to define value before consciousness is spoken. Families do it, institutions do it, cultures do it, and the deepest task remains the same. Can a human being become inwardly sovereign without first being socially guaranteed? Can he build meaning where recognition is incomplete? Can he turn the very fact of standing apart into a source of vision rather than bitterness? Leonardo's early life answers with force. Yes, but at a price. The price is inward labor. The price is solitude. The price is the refusal to let resentment define the self. This is where many fail. To be excluded can produce depth, but it can also produce poison. A wounded ego may spend its life begging for revenge through applause. A wounded spirit may become addicted to proving itself, but a greater response exists. The self can transform its distance into attention. It can turn injury into perception. It can move from, "Why was I denied?" to, "What can I now see that others cannot?" That movement is existential maturity. It is the moment the human being stops treating pain only as accusation and begins treating it as disclosure. Something is revealed in the fracture. Something is stripped bare. You see that every social order is temporary. You see that status is unstable. You see that recognition is shallow when compared to the harder task of becoming real. This is why the outsider often develops a different relationship to truth. Truth is no longer whatever preserves belonging. Truth becomes whatever survives loneliness. Leonardo, as a symbolic figure, stands precisely here. He is not merely the triumphant genius ascending above others. He is the consciousness shaped in partial exile from social completeness. Through him, we see that the edge is not only a place of lack, it is also a place of vision. He could look at the world with unusual hunger because he had not been numbed by easy inheritance. He could cross boundaries because he was not fully domesticated by one secure identity. He could search so widely because the center had never fully convinced him that it was enough. This should force a question onto anyone listening. What part of you still obeys labels that were imposed before you could even think? What have you accepted as your place, simply because the world placed you there early? What if the limits that humiliate you are also the limits that secretly free you from imitation? What if the wound is not only damage, but an opening? The human psyche resists this idea because it wants innocence without rupture. It wants selfhood without conflict. It wants a clear name, a clear place, a clear script. But real becoming does not happen that way. We are shaped where certainty fails. We become visible to ourselves when the inherited mirror cracks. The deepest fear in the human being is not failure, it is the burden of self-creation, because once the old structure weakens, one can no longer hide behind it. Then freedom appears, and freedom is severe. It demands, it exposes, it does not comfort. It asks, "Now that no complete role can save you, what will you become?" This is where the life of Leonardo reaches beyond biography and becomes a philosophical mirror. He shows that a marginal beginning does not condemn a person to smallness, but he also shows that liberation is not gifted. It must be seized inwardly. One must refuse both self-pity and borrowed identity. One must endure the instability of becoming. One must learn to stand without total permission. That is the beginning of all serious life. The world usually honors finished images. It celebrates names once they are secure, polished, monumental. But the real drama begins much earlier, in the invisible battle between imposed definition and inward expansion. The child on the margins faces a brutal temptation: either shrink into the verdict or outgrow it. Leonardo's significance begins in the refusal to shrink, not because he already knew what he would become, but because some force within him would not let the early boundary become the final truth. That refusal is more important than any later masterpiece, because before a person can create works, he must first refuse the lie that he is already fully explained by his origin. And that is the central lesson of this opening movement. A life that begins outside the gate may gain the power to see the gate itself. A person denied total belonging may discover a deeper allegiance, not to status, not to convention, but to the difficult unfolding of the self. Leonardo's marginal condition did not simply mark him, it sharpened him. It did not merely wound his place in the world, it loosened the world's claim over his soul. There, at the threshold between exclusion and awakening, a different kind of freedom was born. That is where true becoming starts, and where every illusion of borrowed identity begins to die. Chapter 2: Curiosity as the Instinct to Live. The first truth is brutal. A mind stops living long before a body dies when it no longer knows how to ask. Leonardo da Vinci was not driven by curiosity as a hobby, nor by knowledge as decoration. He was driven by a deeper hunger, something more severe and more dangerous. He looked at the world as if reality itself were unfinished. He did not stand before existence like a spectator. He confronted it like an unanswered question. Before the modern age turned curiosity into a soft virtue, before people praised creativity while living mechanically, Leonardo had already grasped something far more radical. To look was not passive. To observe was not leisure. To ask was not a style of intelligence. It was a form of existential resistance. It was the refusal to let the world harden into habit. Most people do not suffer because reality is empty. They suffer because they stop seeing it. They move across life covered by familiarity, and familiarity is one of the most efficient forms of blindness. Leonardo broke that blindness. The world for him was never closed. A tree was not merely a tree, water was not merely water. A hand was not merely a hand. Every visible thing carried an invisible principle inside it, and he moved toward that principle with relentless attention. This matters because true curiosity is not the desire to collect facts. It is the demand to penetrate appearances. It strips away the laziness of surface seeing. It confronts the comforting illusion that we already know what surrounds us. And that illusion is one of the deepest prisons of the human mind. Most people think knowledge begins with answers. It does not. It begins with the wound of not knowing. It begins when the soul is strong enough to endure uncertainty without rushing to escape it. Leonardo possessed that strength. He could remain inside a question. He could stay with mystery without killing it too quickly with conclusion. That is rare. Human beings are terrified of open space in thought. They want fast certainty because uncertainty exposes their weakness. The moment a question opens, they scramble to close it. Not because the answer is true, but because ambiguity hurts. Leonardo did the opposite. He entered ambiguity as if it were the gate to truth. This is why observation became more than a method for him. It became a discipline of consciousness. To observe deeply is to admit that the world exceeds your concepts. To observe deeply is to bow before complexity without surrendering your effort to understand it. This is not humble in the sentimental sense. It is fierce. It demands patience, attention, and the destruction of intellectual vanity. A person who truly looks must abandon the arrogance of assumption. He must let reality correct him. He must let the thing seen speak before his ego does. That is where truth begins, not in ideology, not in inherited belief, in looking long enough for illusion to crack. Leonardo understood this before modern science gave it institutional language. When others were satisfied with the visible function of things, he wanted their hidden logic. He was not content with naming. He wanted structure. He wanted movement. He wanted cause. He wanted relation. The eye, for him, was not merely an organ of sight. It was a bridge between the world and the mind, and that bridge had to be sharpened until it could bear the weight of reality. There is a serious philosophical violence in this. To look deeply is to threaten every lazy explanation. It reveals how much of human thought is built not on truth, but on convenience. We do not usually see what is there. We see what allows us to continue without being disturbed. We reduce. We simplify. We rename our confusion as knowledge. We turn living things into dead categories. Leonardo refused this reduction. He treated reality as something still alive, still moving, still hiding more than it reveals at first glance. That is why his curiosity was not ornamental. It was alive because he was alive, and here the modern person must be confronted directly. What have you stopped seeing because you named it too early? What part of life have you buried beneath familiarity? What truth stands before you every day, but your mind no longer meets it because routine has turned wonder into numbness? The problem is not that the world has lost depth. The problem is that the observer has lost courage. It takes courage to admit that even ordinary things are not exhausted by your understanding. It takes courage to face the fact that your first perception is often shallow and your certainty often premature. Modern life makes this worse, not better. In 2025, information floods the mind, but depth continues to disappear. People know more names and understand fewer realities. They scroll across surfaces and call it awareness. They gather fragments and mistake them for vision. Yet accumulation is not insight. Speed is not intelligence. Exposure is not seeing. Leonardo's example cuts through this fraud with merciless clarity. He reminds us that truth does not yield itself to the distracted mind. It reveals itself to the mind that can remain, return, and look again. This is why curiosity is not innocent. It demands sacrifice. To live in a questioning way means refusing the narcotic of mental closure. It means allowing the world to remain larger than your ego. It means tolerating incompletion. Human beings hate incompletion because it destabilizes identity. Once you admit that you do not fully know, you are no longer protected by borrowed authority. You must think, you must observe, you must risk error. You must walk without the guarantee of final ground. Curiosity, then, is not simply intellectual, it is existential. It is the willingness to remain exposed before reality. Leonardo embodies this with unusual force. Through him, we see that intelligence is not first the power to dominate knowledge, but the power to remain vulnerable to it. He did not approach the world merely to conquer it with concepts. He approached it to learn how things truly moved. That shift changes everything. The dominant mind wants control. The philosophical mind wants encounter. One imposes, the other receives, tests, and returns. Leonardo's greatness began not in mastery alone, but in receptivity sharpened into discipline. This is where a common misunderstanding must be destroyed. People often imagine curiosity as restlessness, without center, as wandering attention, as fascination jumping from object to object. But genuine curiosity is not scattered appetite. It is concentrated hunger. It does not drift. It penetrates. It is not entertained by the surface of many things. It is compelled by the hidden order within them. Leonardo moved across fields, not because he lacked focus, but because he sensed that reality itself is interconnected. Nature does not divide itself according to academic departments. Water, motion, anatomy, light, expression, proportion, growth, force, and form belong to one living fabric. He did not invent this unity. He perceived it. That perception carries a deep lesson about human consciousness. The mind becomes larger when it stops worshiping artificial boundaries. Many people imprison themselves inside one label because labels create safety. Artist, scientist, thinker, worker, believer, skeptic. The label narrows the field and grants identity. But life is not narrow. Existence spills across categories. Leonardo's curiosity crossed these borders because he sensed that truth lives at the point where divisions break down. To follow reality seriously is to betray simplification. It is to let the object of inquiry dictate the path, even when the path crosses familiar lines. The inward psychology behind this is severe. Why do most people stop asking? Why do they prefer ready-made explanations to living questions? Because questions threaten the self-image. A real question does not merely ask about the world, it exposes the poverty of the one asking. It reveals what you do not know, what you have avoided, what you assumed too quickly, what you repeated without testing. That is why curiosity requires a form of courage deeper than ambition. Ambition wants achievement. Curiosity wants truth, even when truth humiliates. Leonardo's life reveals this difference. He was not simply collecting brilliance to impress the world, he was pursuing coherence in the face of mystery. That is a different moral posture. It is more demanding and more lonely. The person who asks deeply cannot remain entirely comfortable among those who live by repetition. He becomes harder to satisfy, harder to deceive, harder to domesticate. Curiosity, when it reaches full force, becomes a threat to conformity because it refuses inherited limits on seeing. It asks again. It looks again. It doubts what others accept. It reopens what society has already declared finished. This is why curiosity is bound to freedom, not the shallow freedom of preference, but the harder freedom of consciousness released from automatic obedience. The person who truly observes becomes less governable by slogans, appearances, and collective sleep. He begins to see mechanisms where others see destiny. He begins to detect contradiction where others feel comfort. He begins to understand that reality is not obligated to match convention. Leonardo's gaze was powerful because it was not enslaved to what was already socially settled. He trusted looking more than inherited closure. He stands, then, as more than an individual genius. He becomes a symbol of a rarer human possibility. Through him, we see that the mind can live in a state of active contact with the world. It does not need to deaden itself with familiarity. It does not need to reduce everything to utility. It can still be seized by form, movement, pattern, and hidden necessity. It can still be shocked by the ordinary. It can still treat a leaf, a face, a current of water, or the mechanics of the body as entrances into the structure of existence itself. That is not excess. That is vitality. And this exposes a final wound in the modern soul. Many people do not lack access to knowledge. They lack the inward fire that makes knowledge transformative. They consume information without being changed by it because they no longer approach the world with reverence sharpened by inquiry. Their minds are full, but their perception is weak. Leonardo forces a harder standard. To know is not to possess data. To know is to let attention become so exact that reality begins to reveal its hidden architecture. That level of seeing alters the one who sees. This is the deeper meaning of his curiosity. It was not escape from life. It was contact with life in its most demanding form. He observed because he refused dead existence. He questioned because he refused second-hand reality. He looked deeply because only depth could satisfy a consciousness unwilling to live on the skin of things. The world was open to him because he remained open to its difficulty. That is the beginning of all real intelligence and the beginning of all real freedom. And the moment a human being dares to look that deeply, the world stops being familiar and starts becoming true. Chapter 3. The Workshop as a School of Existence. Greatness is not born in inspiration, it is beaten into form by labor. Leonardo da Vinci did not become himself by dreaming in isolation. He became himself inside the workshop, inside dust, repetition, failure, correction, material resistance, and the long humiliation of learning how the hand obeys the eye only after discipline has broken its pride. This is what that place truly was, not merely a site of training, but a school of existence. Before the modern world began worshipping talent as if genius were a mystical accident, the Renaissance workshop had already exposed a harder truth. No vision becomes real without submission to process. No beauty enters the world untouched by effort. No creator escapes the weight of material fact. Leonardo entered the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio not as a finished prodigy, but as an unformed force that had to be shaped through contact with reality. That matters because the human being does not mature by possibility alone. He matures when possibility collides with discipline and does not flee. The romantic lie says that art is freedom from labor. The truth is the opposite. Art is one of labor's highest forms. The hand must learn to grind pigment, to prepare panels, to carry out repetitive tasks that seem far beneath glory. The body must repeat motions until they stop being clumsy. The eye must be educated until it no longer sees vaguely, lazily, sentimentally. And the ego must suffer. It must suffer the fact that wanting to create and being able to create are not the same. This is where many people break. They love the image of mastery, but not the long apprenticeship of limitation. Leonardo was forced into that apprenticeship. Inside the workshop, beauty was not floating above the world as an ideal. It was tied to wood, metal, stone, color, proportion, pressure, timing, and exactness. That is the first philosophical lesson of the workshop. Reality does not bow to imagination simply because imagination is intense. Matter resists. Form resists. Technique resists. The world demands that the creator prove himself through practice. This is not cruelty. It is purification. It strips away fantasy and reveals whether desire has enough depth to become craft. There is something morally serious in that. The workshop does not ask who you think you are. It asks what your work can bear. It does not care about self-image. It cares about precision. It does not reward emotion merely because emotion is sincere. It demands translation, and translation is painful. A feeling in the soul is easy. Giving it form in the world is hard. That gap between inward intensity and outward execution is where character is forged. Leonardo learned early that creation is not self-expression in the cheap modern sense. It is the conquest of confusion through order. That is why discipline matters more than excitement. Excitement begins things. Discipline gives them body. In the workshop, the young artist was not allowed to worship spontaneity. He had to observe, imitate, refine, repeat. He had to learn the structure beneath the image. He had to accept hierarchy, correction, slowness, and craft. These are not secondary conditions. They are the furnace of becoming. Human beings often want transcendence without obedience to form, but there is no deep freedom without first passing through necessity. You do not escape limits by ignoring them. You escape them by mastering them. This is the deeper truth hidden inside labor. Labor is not merely expenditure, it is confrontation. Through work, the human being meets resistance and is forced to become more exact. Through repetition, he discovers where he is weak. Through failure, he sees the distance between fantasy and ability. Through correction, he is stripped of vanity. The workshop, therefore, becomes more than an artistic environment. It becomes a psychological battlefield. Each task silently asks the same question. Will you endure the insult of being unfinished? Most people cannot endure it. They want early confirmation. They want evidence that they are already exceptional. They want admiration before structure. Applause before competence, identity before testing. But real formation begins when admiration is absent and the task remains. Leonardo's path through the workshop reminds us that maturity is not the inflation of self-belief. It is the hardening of attention. It is the moment the individual stops asking whether he feels gifted and starts asking whether he can submit himself to the rigor that truth requires. This is where the workshop becomes existential. It teaches that existence itself is craftsmanship. A human life is not given shape by desire alone. It is built through repeated acts of correction. One learns to see more clearly, to move more precisely, to distinguish what is essential from what is decorative. The disciplined maker and the disciplined soul are not separate figures. They obey the same law. What is crude must be refined. What is excessive must be restrained. What is weak must be strengthened through encounter with what resists it. Leonardo's development inside that environment was not just technical growth. It was a deep training in how reality works. He did not merely learn how to paint. He learned that form emerges from pressure. He learned that excellence is not a sudden eruption, but a long agreement with demands most people try to avoid. He learned that creation grows inside structure, not outside it. This is why the workshop matters philosophically. It shatters the illusion that freedom means the absence of constraint. No. The highest freedom appears when constraint has been mastered so fully that it becomes power. The modern world hates this lesson. In 2025, people still want results without apprenticeship. They want expression without formation. They want originality without inheritance, authority without labor, and brilliance without repetition. They confuse instinct with depth. They confuse visibility with achievement. They think that because technology accelerates production, it can replace inner discipline. It cannot. Speed only hides weakness better. It does not remove weakness. The soul that has never endured the friction of real work remains fragile, no matter how confident it appears. Leonardo exposes this with merciless force. His workshop years reveal that the path to greatness runs through humility before method, not humiliation for its own sake, but the necessary collapse of the false self that believes desire alone is enough. The apprentice has to become small before the work. He has to accept that beauty will not descend merely because he wants it. He must train the hand until it stops lying. He must train the eye until it stops glancing. He must train the mind until it stops rushing. What is this if not a moral discipline disguised as artistic labor? The body is involved in this truth more than modern intellectual culture wants to admit. We like to imagine intelligence as abstract, but the workshop destroys that fantasy. Intelligence becomes muscular. It enters the wrist, the fingers, posture, breathing, timing. Thought is no longer separate from action. Judgment becomes embodied. To measure, carve, mix, sketch, and refine is to think through matter. Leonardo's greatness would later appear vast and fluid, but it was built on this grounding. He learned that the mind reaches depth only when it can remain faithful to concrete detail. Vision without execution is self-deception. There is also a social truth inside the workshop. Creation does not emerge from pure solitude alone. The workshop is a shared field of effort, hierarchy, imitation, correction, and silent competition. The apprentice learns by proximity. He sees how others solve problems, how the master judges, how failure is hidden or exposed, how quality is recognized by those whose standards are higher than comfort. This is important because the self becomes sharper when placed among demands that exceed it. To grow, one must stand near forms of excellence that do not flatter weakness. Verrocchio, as a symbolic figure here, represents more than a teacher. He represents the law of formation itself. Through him, we see that the young Leonardo did not rise by escaping structure, but by entering it deeply enough to be transformed by it. The master is not important because he dominates. He is important because he forces the apprentice to confront a standard beyond mood. In a culture obsessed with self-invention, this is nearly unbearable to hear. But it remains true. Before one can innovate, one must first become capable. Before one can break form meaningfully, one must know what form is. This destroys another modern delusion. People think discipline kills creativity. In reality, weak discipline kills it. Only the undisciplined mind is trapped in cliché because it lacks the strength to go further than impulse. True discipline does not shrink imagination. It sharpens it. It gives it muscle, endurance, and accuracy. The workshop was therefore not a cage for Leonardo's creativity. It was the condition that made his later freedom possible. Because once the basic laws of form, structure, craft, and observation had entered his being, imagination could move with force instead of confusion. The human soul resists this because it fears subordination. It fears the stage where it is not yet remarkable. It fears the anonymity of training. It fears being one among many, doing basic tasks, building foundations no one applauds. But this fear reveals something ugly. It reveals how much of our ambition is not love of truth or beauty, but hunger for recognition. The workshop attacks that hunger. It places the individual under a law larger than vanity. It says, "Become worthy before you demand to be seen." That is why labor is spiritually dangerous and spiritually necessary. Dangerous because it exposes mediocrity without pity. Necessary because without that exposure, the self remains inflated and hollow. Through work, one meets one's own fragmentation. Through discipline, one begins to gather oneself into form. Leonardo's early years in the workshop were not a waiting room before greatness. They were greatness in seed because they contained the essential conversion. A restless intelligence was being forced into craft. A gifted eye was being trained to obey rigor. A potential self was becoming an actual one. And this reaches beyond art into the structure of all serious living. Every human being has a workshop, whether literal or invisible. Some are shaped by the discipline of making, some by study, some by suffering, some by responsibility, but the law remains. You do not become real by admiring what you might be. You become real by enduring the process that reveals what you are not yet. Existence itself is a long apprenticeship in form. So when we look at the young Leonardo in that workshop, we should not merely see a future genius learning technique. We should see a human being entering the furnace where illusion burns off. He is learning that beauty is costly. He is learning that labor is not beneath greatness, but its foundation. He is learning that the real creator is not the one who waits for inspiration, but the one who can remain faithful to discipline until matter begins to yield. There, amid repetition, correction, and the stern logic of craft, a deeper truth is revealed. The self is not discovered in comfort. It is built in resistance. And the moment a human being accepts that law, talent stops being a promise and starts becoming destiny. Chapter 4, When Art is no longer only for beauty. Art begins to matter when it stops pleasing the eye and starts disturbing the mind. Leonardo da Vinci did not paint merely to decorate surfaces or flatter patrons. He used painting as a way to think. He used form as inquiry. He used beauty not as an end, but as an entrance. That is the real threshold here. The image is no longer a passive object to admire. It becomes an instrument that cuts into reality. Before the modern world separated art from knowledge, before beauty was reduced to taste, style, and personal preference, Leonardo had already seen something more dangerous. A painting could do more than charm. It could reveal. It could strip away the fog of habit. It could bring the visible world into such exact order that truth itself began to emerge through line, light, gesture, and relation. This is why his art cannot be understood as ornament. It must be understood as cognition. To paint, for him, was to investigate the structure of existence. Most people look at an image and ask whether it is beautiful. Leonardo forces a harder question. What does beauty reveal when it is not treated as comfort, but as access? What lies behind proportion, behind expression, behind shadow, behind the silent arrangement of bodies in space? The shallow eye wants pleasure. The deeper eye wants essence. Leonardo belonged to the second kind. He did not merely want the world to appear on a surface. He wanted the surface to become transparent enough for the hidden order beneath it to be sensed. That changes the meaning of painting itself. Once art becomes a form of thinking, the painter is no longer just a maker of images. He becomes a reader of reality. He studies how light moves, how flesh carries emotion, how distance alters perception, how the body reveals the mind without speaking. He does not copy the world like a machine. He confronts it, interprets it, and returns it in a form more intense than ordinary seeing. The painting then becomes not a mirror, but a sharpened encounter. It shows not just what is there, but what is usually missed. This is why Leonardo's art carries philosophical weight. He understood that appearance is not trivial. Appearance is the gate through which essence first announces itself. Most people either get trapped at the surface or try to leap beyond it too quickly. Leonardo did neither. He stayed with the visible until the visible began to confess its depth. A face was never just a face. A hand was never just anatomy. A landscape was never only background. Every visible thing carried relations, forces, tensions, and meanings that ordinary perception overlooked. Painting became his method for making those hidden dimensions legible. There is a ruthless discipline in that. To think through images is harder than people assume. Words can hide vagueness. Images expose it. If the relation between two figures is false, the whole composition collapses. If the gesture is weak, the meaning dies. If the light does not reveal the emotional truth of the scene, beauty becomes empty display. Leonardo knew that an image must hold together not only visually, but ontologically. It must contain a way of being. It must embody a law of perception. It must reveal something true about the world, or else it remains lifeless, no matter how polished it is. This is where beauty becomes serious. Beauty is not mere prettiness. It is not softness. It is not a narcotic. Real beauty organizes chaos into intelligible form. It allows the mind to enter what would otherwise remain scattered. It attracts, yes, but it attracts toward depth. Leonardo understood that the human being is often reached through wonder before he is reached through argument. The eye is seduced first, then the deeper work begins. Beauty opens the door, but what waits beyond the door is not comfort. It is confrontation with structure. That is why his art belongs to a larger struggle against superficiality. Human beings are constantly tempted to live on the skin of things. They want easy names, quick judgments, and images that reassure rather than challenge. They want the visible to remain simple because complexity places demands on the observer. But Leonardo's vision refuses this laziness. He asks the eye to slow down. He asks perception to become precise. He asks the viewer to submit to layers of relation that cannot be consumed instantly. In that sense, his painting is not entertainment. It is training. It disciplines vision. The modern world needs that discipline more than ever. In 2025, images flood consciousness with unprecedented force, yet seeing has become weaker. People consume visual stimulation endlessly and understand almost nothing of what they see. The image is everywhere, but perception is thin. Beauty has been trivialized into branding, seduction, and market value. The eye has been trained to react, not to contemplate. Leonardo stands against this collapse like a blade. He reminds us that the image can still be a site of truth, but only if the observer is willing to meet it with attention rather than appetite. This is the deeper meaning of painting as cognition. The image does not simply show the world. It teaches us how to see the world. It reorganizes consciousness. It reveals that reality is made not of isolated objects, but of dynamic relations. Light defines form. Form carries movement. Movement implies force. Force shapes emotion. Emotion alters expression. Expression reveals inward life. Nothing stands alone. Everything participates in a larger order. Leonardo's paintings matter because they do not freeze reality into dead appearance. They preserve the tremor of living interconnection. And that leads into something even more severe. Art, at its highest level, does not only represent the world, it interrogates the observer. What do you notice? What do you ignore? What truths pass before you each day without entering awareness because your sight is lazy, rushed, or corrupted by expectation? Leonardo's work forces the eye into moral labor. To see well is not just an aesthetic skill. It is an ethical posture. The careless eye does violence to reality because it reduces what is complex to what is convenient. The attentive eye restores dignity to the thing seen. This is why beauty and truth cannot be cleanly separated. The modern mind often distrusts beauty because beauty can seduce and deceive. That fear is not foolish. False beauty exists. Decorative beauty exists. Manipulated beauty exists. But Leonardo was pursuing something harder. He sought beauty that emerges from inner coherence, from structural necessity, from fidelity to the nature of the thing. Such beauty does not distract from truth. It discloses it. It is the radiance of order made visible. It is what happens when the world is rendered with such precision that its hidden law begins to shine through form. This is also why his figures seem to carry more than bodily presence. They feel inward. They seem inhabited by thought, tension, waiting, secrecy. He did not paint humans as surfaces. He painted them as thresholds. Through posture, glance, stillness, and relation, he suggested that the visible body is only the outer edge of consciousness. That insight matters because human beings are constantly misread. We are seen quickly, labeled quickly, flattened quickly. Leonardo's art resists flattening. It reminds us that every face conceals an interiority too deep for instant possession. The same is true of nature in his work. Nature is not background decoration. It is a living field of correspondences. Rock, water, atmosphere, distance, and shadow all participate in the same logic of becoming. The world is not divided into separate compartments. Human emotion, bodily form, and natural movement all answer to common principles. This is why painting, for Leonardo, could never be merely visual pleasure. It was a way of tracing unity across apparent difference. It revealed that the world is intelligible not because it is simple, but because its complexity has order. That order is precisely what modern consciousness keeps losing. We live amid fragmentation, one field cut off from another, one identity cut off from another, one sensation replacing the next before meaning can take root. Leonardo's example attacks this condition. He shows that knowledge deepens when perception becomes patient enough to hold complexity without collapsing it. The eye, the hand, and the mind must work together. Art is no longer separate from philosophy. It becomes philosophy in visible form. This is where a serious misunderstanding must be destroyed. People think art becomes profound when it is obscure. Not always. Obscurity can be emptiness, hiding behind mystery. Leonardo's depth did not come from confusion. It came from exactness. He reached the unsayable not by abandoning form, but by making form so precise that it began to suggest what words could not capture. That is the paradox of great art. The more disciplined the visible becomes, the more powerfully it gestures toward the invisible. The more faithful the image is to reality, the more it reveals what reality withholds from careless sight. Through Leonardo, we see that painting can become a spiritual act without ceasing to be concrete. It can remain rooted in flesh, light, geometry, and material technique while still reaching toward metaphysical depth. That is no small achievement. It means the path to essence does not require escaping the world. It requires seeing the world so truthfully that essence begins to emerge from within it. This is the opposite of fantasy. It is revelation through fidelity, and that demands something from us as well. We cannot stand before such art as passive consumers. We must become worthy of what we look at. We must let attention lengthen. We must endure ambiguity without rushing to premature explanation. We must stop asking only whether something is beautiful and begin asking what kind of truth its beauty is carrying. This is where the observer grows. The painting becomes a test, not of taste, but of depth. Leonardo, as a symbolic figure in this movement, proves that the artist is not merely a creator of pleasing forms. He is a witness to reality and a judge of false seeing. Through him, art becomes a blade against illusion. It cuts through decorative emptiness. It exposes the poverty of superficial vision. It reveals that beauty, when joined to disciplined perception, can become one of the sharpest instruments of knowledge available to the human mind. So the meaning of his art cannot be contained inside galleries, praise, or fame. Its deeper meaning is existential. It tells us that the world is richer than habit admits. It tells us that appearance is not the enemy of truth, but one of its necessary openings. It tells us that to see deeply is already to begin thinking deeply. And it tells us that the beautiful becomes dangerous the moment it stops asking to be admired and starts demanding to be understood. That is where art ceases to flatter the eye and begins to uncover the real. Chapter 5. The obsession with perfection is the refusal to lie. Perfection is not the pursuit of flawlessness. It is the refusal to accept falsehood. Leonardo da Vinci did not chase perfection because he wanted admiration. He chased it because anything less felt like betrayal. Not betrayal of others, betrayal of reality itself. This is where his work becomes dangerous, because perfection, in its true form, is not aesthetic luxury. It is moral severity. Before the modern world diluted perfection into polish, before it turned excellence into performance and metrics, Leonardo had already grasped something far more radical. To perfect a work is to align it with truth as closely as human effort allows. It is to remove distortion laziness, approximation, and self-deception. It is to confront the gap between what is seen and what is rendered, between what is understood and what is expressed. That gap is where most people surrender. Leonardo did not. Most creators stop when the work is good enough to be accepted. Leonardo continued when acceptance was already secured. That difference reveals everything. The ordinary mind seeks completion, the deeper mind seeks accuracy. Completion satisfies the social world. Accuracy satisfies the inner demand for coherence. These two are not the same. A work can be finished and still be false. It can be praised and still betray the structure it claims to represent. Leonardo sensed this with unbearable clarity. That is why he delayed, revised, reworked, and sometimes abandoned. Not because he was indecisive, but because he refused to lie. Perfection, then, becomes a form of resistance. Resistance against the pressure to finalize prematurely. Resistance against the seduction of recognition. Resistance against the temptation to replace truth with approximation. Human beings crave closure. They want to say, this is done, this is enough, this is complete. But closure often arrives before understanding. It seals the work before it has reached its necessary depth. Leonardo's obsession breaks that pattern. He reopens what others close. He doubts what others declare sufficient. He remains inside the work longer than comfort allows. This is psychologically brutal. To pursue perfection in this sense is to live without the relief of easy endings. It means carrying unresolved tension. It means seeing flaws where others see success. It means being unable to rest inside praise because praise does not erase inaccuracy. This is why perfection is not attractive. It isolates. It demands. It exposes. The one who follows it cannot rely on external validation as final authority. He must answer to a more silent and more severe judge. The work itself. That judge is unforgiving. It does not negotiate with ego. It does not soften its verdict because effort was sincere. It asks only one question: is this true to what it claims to be? If not, it remains incomplete, no matter how beautiful it appears. Leonardo lived under this law. His slowness, often criticized, was not weakness, it was fidelity. He allowed the work to resist him. He allowed time to reveal what quick execution would have hidden. He accepted that depth cannot be rushed without being destroyed. Here, the modern individual must face an uncomfortable reflection. Why do you rush to finish? What are you trying to escape? Is it boredom? Is it doubt? Or is it the fear that if you stay longer, you will be forced to see more clearly, and seeing more clearly will expose your limits? Most people do not stop early because the work is complete. They stop because their tolerance for imperfection in themselves has reached its limit. They retreat into completion to avoid further confrontation. Leonardo did not retreat. He stayed. He endured the discomfort of not yet being sufficient. That endurance is the hidden core of mastery. Talent opens the path, but endurance carries the body across it. Without endurance, talent becomes decoration. With endurance, it becomes force. The obsession with perfection is therefore not about making things look better. It is about becoming capable of sustaining attention long enough for truth to emerge. This reveals a deeper layer of existential psychology. Human beings are not only afraid of failure, they are afraid of exactness. Exactness leaves no room for illusion. When something is rendered precisely, its weaknesses are exposed without mercy. Approximation allows the ego to hide. Precision does not. That is why many prefer vagueness. Vagueness protects identity. Precision threatens it. Leonardo chose precision, and by doing so, he chose a life of continuous self-exposure. This is also why perfection is never fully achieved. It is approached, it is pursued, it is sharpened, but it is never possessed. The moment one believes it has been reached, stagnation begins. Leonardo understood this intuitively. His unfinished works are not signs of failure. They are signs of an awareness that the work could still be deepened. This is difficult to accept because the modern mind equates value with completion, but there is a higher standard. Value can exist in the intensity of pursuit, not only in the state of finishing. This does not mean abandoning completion altogether. It means redefining what completion means. A work is complete not when it satisfies external expectation, but when it has reached the highest level of truth the Creator can currently sustain. That threshold moves as the Creator grows. What was once sufficient becomes inadequate. What once seemed precise becomes crude. This movement is not instability, it is evolution. Leonardo lived inside this movement. He did not freeze himself at one level of competence. He allowed his own standards to rise beyond his past achievements. The modern world resists this because it demands output. In 2025, speed dominates value. The faster something is produced, the more visible it becomes. The more visible it becomes, the more it is mistaken for importance. But visibility is not depth. Production is not truth. The system rewards those who finish quickly, not those who refine deeply. This creates a culture where approximation thrives and precision becomes rare. Leonardo's example cuts directly against this current. He reminds us that the most meaningful work often grows slowly, invisibly, and against pressure. There is also a moral courage in refusing to finalize too soon. To delay completion is to risk misunderstanding. It is to risk being seen as inefficient, uncertain, even incapable. Leonardo accepted that risk. He did not let the judgment of others dictate the rhythm of his process. This independence is essential. Without it, perfection collapses into performance. The work becomes a response to expectation rather than a pursuit of truth. And once that shift happens, depth disappears. Leonardo, as a symbolic figure here, represents the Creator who refuses compromise with false adequacy. Through him, we see that perfection is not a static ideal floating above the world. It is an active tension between vision and execution. It is the constant pressure to close the distance between what is imagined and what is realized. That distance never fully disappears, but the effort to reduce it defines the seriousness of the work. This effort transforms the Creator himself. To pursue perfection is to refine perception, judgment, patience, and integrity. It forces the individual to become more exact, more disciplined, more honest. The work becomes a mirror that cannot be manipulated. It reflects back the true state of the one who creates it. Weakness appears as imprecision. Confusion appears as inconsistency. Superficiality appears as decorative excess. Nothing can be hidden for long. The pursuit of perfection therefore becomes a path of self-confrontation. This is why many avoid it. It is easier to produce something acceptable than to produce something true. It is easier to be praised than to be exact. It is easier to finish than to refine. But these choices accumulate. Over time, they shape the soul. The one who consistently chooses ease becomes shallow, even if successful. The one who chooses depth becomes slower, more demanding, and often less understood. Leonardo chose the second path, not because it was rewarding, but because anything else would have been a lie. And this brings us to the final tension. When does the pursuit of perfection become paralysis? When does refinement become avoidance? This question cannot be answered by external rules. It must be answered inwardly. The Creator must sense when further work deepens truth and when it merely postpones completion out of fear. This is a delicate boundary. Leonardo walked it constantly. Sometimes he crossed it, sometimes he remained within it. But the existence of that tension does not invalidate the pursuit. It proves its seriousness. Perfection, then, is not a destination. It is a discipline of honesty carried to its limit. It is the refusal to let the work settle into comfort. It is the willingness to endure incompletion until form and truth come into closer alignment. It is the recognition that what is easy to finish is often not worth finishing, and what is worth finishing demands more than the ego initially offers. The human being stands before this choice in every act of creation, whether artistic or existential. Will you accept what is sufficient, or will you push toward what is true? Will you close the work to protect yourself, or will you keep it open long enough to be transformed by it? Leonardo's life does not provide comfort here. It provides a standard, a severe one. And the moment you refuse to lie in your work, you realize that perfection is not about making things flawless, but about becoming incapable of accepting what is false. Chapter 6. The unity of knowledge is the refusal to divide reality. Knowledge becomes false the moment it is divided against itself. Leonardo da Vinci did not see the world as separate domains stitched together by convenience. He saw continuity. He saw connection. He saw that to isolate one part of reality from another is not clarity, but distortion. This is where his thinking cuts deeper than most. Because the human mind is addicted to separation, and separation gives the illusion of control. Before the modern world fragmented knowledge into disciplines, before science, art, anatomy, engineering, and philosophy became isolated territories guarded by specialists, Leonardo had already perceived something more fundamental. Reality does not recognize our categories. Nature does not obey our intellectual borders. The division between fields is not found in the world. It is imposed by the human need to simplify what is too vast to grasp all at once. This is the first rupture. The moment knowledge is divided for the sake of convenience, understanding begins to weaken. Each field deepens itself but loses sight of the whole. The specialist becomes precise but blind. He knows more about less. He masters a fragment and forgets that the fragment belongs to a larger structure. Leonardo resisted this fragmentation instinctively. He moved across anatomy, mechanics, painting, geometry, and natural observation not because he lacked focus, but because he sensed the truth lives in the relationship between things, not in their isolation. Most people misunderstand this. They think unity means knowing everything. It does not. Unity means seeing how things relate. It means recognizing that movement in water reflects movement in air, that the structure of the human body echoes the structure of natural forces, that light shaping a face follows the same logic as light shaping a landscape. These are not poetic associations. They are structural correspondences. Leonardo's mind operated by tracing these correspondences until reality revealed itself as one continuous system rather than disconnected parts. This demands a different kind of intelligence. Not accumulation, but integration. Not memorizing facts, but perceiving patterns. The divided mind collects information. The unified mind organizes it into meaning, and meaning is what most people lack. They know fragments, they repeat fragments, they live among fragments, but they do not see how those fragments form a coherent whole. That is why modern knowledge often feels powerful and empty at the same time. It expands outward, but does not deepen inward. Leonardo refused that emptiness. He treated knowledge as a living network. Each discovery in one area illuminated another. Each observation became a bridge. This is why his work appears restless to those who cannot follow its logic. He was not wandering, he was connecting. He was building an internal map of reality where nothing stood alone. The hand was linked to movement, movement to force, force to structure, structure to form, form to perception, perception to knowledge, knowledge to creation. This chain is unbroken, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. The psychological resistance to this unity is profound. Human beings prefer separation because it reduces responsibility. If knowledge is divided, then one can ignore what lies outside one's field. One can avoid complexity. One can avoid contradiction. But once unity is recognized, escape becomes impossible. Everything begins to matter. Every action connects to a larger system. Every error echoes beyond its immediate context. The unified vision forces the mind to become more careful, more attentive, more responsible. This is why unity is not comforting. It is demanding. It removes the illusion that we can understand life in pieces without consequence. It exposes how shallow most thinking is. It reveals that the boundaries we rely on are often defenses against depth. Leonardo stepped beyond those defenses. He allowed reality to appear as it is, not as it is convenient to categorize. The modern world intensifies the opposite tendency. In 2025, knowledge is more accessible than ever, yet more fragmented than ever. People specialize earlier, think narrower, and rarely cross boundaries. The system rewards efficiency, not integration. It values expertise, but often ignores coherence. As a result, individuals become highly skilled in limited areas while remaining disconnected from the broader structure of existence. This creates a paradox. We advance technologically while regressing in understanding. Leonardo stands as a direct challenge to this condition. He shows that true intelligence is not confined by artificial divisions. It moves freely, but not randomly. It follows the logic of reality itself. It recognizes that to understand one thing deeply, one must see its relation to many others. Depth is not achieved by narrowing endlessly. It is achieved by connecting precisely. This does not mean abandoning specialization. It means refusing to let specialization become blindness. The expert must remain open to what lies beyond his field. He must allow his knowledge to be questioned, expanded, and recontextualized. Otherwise, expertise hardens into limitation. Leonardo avoided this trap because he never allowed himself to become intellectually enclosed. His curiosity forced him outward, but his discipline kept his exploration structured. There is also an existential dimension to this unity. A fragmented understanding of the world produces a fragmented self. When knowledge is disconnected, the individual becomes internally divided. One part of the mind knows, another part ignores, one part acts, another part doubts. Coherence disappears. But when knowledge begins to unify, something shifts. The self becomes more integrated. Thought, perception, and action align more closely. The individual becomes less contradictory, less scattered, more whole. This is not a mystical claim. It is a psychological reality. The way we understand the world shapes the way we exist within it. A divided vision produces a divided life. A unified vision produces a more coherent one. Leonardo's mind, in this sense, was not only intellectually expansive, it was existentially integrated. He did not simply know many things. He understood how they belonged together. That belonging gave his work its depth and his perception its clarity. Through Leonardo as a symbolic figure, we see that the highest form of knowledge is not dominance over information, but harmony with structure. He did not stand above reality as a controller. He moved within it as an interpreter. He listened to how things connected. He followed those connections without forcing them into artificial limits. This is why his thinking still feels alive. It was not built on rigid systems, but on living relationships. This forces a final question onto the modern mind. What have you separated that should never have been divided? What connections have you ignored because they complicate your understanding? What truths remain invisible to you because your thinking is confined within artificial borders? The cost of fragmentation is not only intellectual, it is existential. It narrows perception. It weakens judgment. It reduces the richness of experience to manageable but shallow categories. Leonardo's path offers no easy solution, but it offers a direction. Do not divide reality to make it easier to handle. Expand perception until complexity becomes intelligible. Do not isolate knowledge to feel secure. Connect it until meaning emerges. Do not accept boundaries that exist only for convenience. Test them, cross them, break them if necessary. Because in the end, reality does not belong to our systems. Our systems must rise to meet reality. And the moment the mind begins to see the world as one continuous structure, knowledge stops being accumulation and becomes understanding. Chapter 7. Solitude is where the self stops borrowing. A human being does not become himself in noise. He becomes himself in separation. Leonardo da Vinci did not grow in the center of constant affirmation, nor in the comfort of collective certainty. He grew in intervals of solitude where the mind is forced to stand without support. That is where the borrowed voice fades. That is where the real voice begins. Before the modern world filled every silence with distraction, before solitude was mistaken for loneliness and quickly anesthetized by endless stimulation, Leonardo had already entered a more severe condition. To be alone is not merely to lack company. It is to face the absence of external structure, no immediate validation, no instant correction, no social mirror to stabilize identity. And this absence is dangerous, because without the mirror of others, the self is no longer confirmed. It must confront itself directly. Most people avoid this confrontation. They remain surrounded, connected, occupied, and constantly addressed by external signals. Not because connection is inherently wrong, but because silence reveals something they do not want to see. In silence, the noise of borrowed identity begins to dissolve. What remains is unstable, unfinished, often uncomfortable. The question emerges without protection. Who are you when no one is watching? When no role is required? When no expectation is guiding you? Leonardo entered that space not as an escape, but as a necessity. His work demanded long periods of inward concentration. Observation requires stillness. Thinking requires distance. Creation requires the ability to remain with something without interruption. But beyond these practical conditions, something deeper was forming. Solitude became a field where he could examine reality without distortion from immediate social pressure. He could look longer. He could question further. He could doubt more honestly. This is where solitude becomes philosophical. It is not isolation for its own sake. It is the stripping away of interference. The human mind is constantly shaped by the presence of others. We adjust, perform, anticipate, and react. Even unconsciously, we edit ourselves to fit the expected frame. Solitude interrupts this process. It removes the audience. It removes the immediate demand to be recognized. And without that demand, something more difficult appears: the raw structure of one's own thought. That structure is rarely as clear as we imagine. It is fragmented, inconsistent, uncertain. This is why solitude is often experienced as discomfort rather than peace. The illusion of coherence collapses. Contradictions surface, doubts intensify. The self realizes that it is not as unified as it pretends to be. Most people retreat at this point. They return to noise, to conversation, to distraction, to anything that restores the illusion of stability. Leonardo did not retreat. He remained. Remaining in solitude requires a different kind of strength. Not the strength to act, but the strength to endure the absence of direction, to sit with a question that has no immediate answer, to observe without rushing to conclusion, to think without needing approval. This is a form of inner independence that cannot be borrowed. It must be built, and it is built precisely in those moments where the mind refuses to escape its own depth. This is why solitude is inseparable from originality. Not originality as novelty, but originality as origin. To think originally is to think from a place not entirely shaped by repetition, but that place can only be reached when the influence of others temporarily loosens its grip. Leonardo's ideas, his movements across disciplines, his refusal to accept fixed categories, all carry the mark of a mind that has spent time outside immediate conformity. He was not cut off from the world, but he was not absorbed by it either. This balance is critical. Solitude does not mean rejection of others. It means the capacity to step back from them without losing oneself. It means the ability to return to the world without being entirely defined by it. Many people either dissolve into social expectation or withdraw completely into isolation. Both are forms of escape. Leonardo represents a third path. Engage, but do not submit. Withdraw, but do not disappear. Move between connection and solitude with awareness. The modern condition makes this increasingly difficult. In 2025, silence has become rare. The mind is constantly addressed, notified, stimulated, and interrupted. Even when physically alone, the individual remains mentally surrounded. This creates a paradox. People are alone more often, yet rarely experience true solitude. They carry the noise within them. They cannot disconnect because their identity has become dependent on continuous input. Without it, they feel empty. But that emptiness is not the problem. It is the entrance. The emptiness reveals how much of the self has been constructed from external fragments. It reveals how little remains when those fragments fall away. Leonardo's example forces a harsh recognition. If you cannot remain alone without distraction, then your identity is not yet your own. It is assembled. It is maintained by constant reinforcement. It is fragile. Solitude, then, becomes an act of reclamation, not of comfort, but of ownership. The individual begins to take responsibility for his own perception, his own thought, his own direction. He no longer relies entirely on external signals to define what matters. This does not make life easier. It makes it more demanding, because once you stop borrowing meaning, you must create it. This is where existential weight appears. Freedom expands, but so does responsibility. Without the constant presence of others to guide behavior, the individual must decide what to think, what to pursue, what to value. These decisions are no longer buffered by collective agreement. They stand exposed, and exposure creates anxiety. Many retreat from this stage because it removes the comfort of shared certainty. Leonardo did not retreat. He accepted that uncertainty is the price of independence. There is also a transformation in perception that occurs in solitude. When the mind is no longer constantly reacting, it begins to observe differently. Details emerge, patterns become visible, time slows, attention deepens. This is not mystical, it is structural. The absence of interruption allows perception to extend itself. Leonardo's ability to see what others missed was not only a result of intelligence, it was a result of sustained attention, and sustained attention requires distance from noise. Through Leonardo as a symbolic figure, we see that solitude is not emptiness, but density. It is filled with thought, observation, tension, and becoming. It is where the self confronts its own incompletion without distraction. It is where the borrowed dissolves and the authentic begins to form. Not fully, not perfectly, but genuinely. This forces a final confrontation. What are you avoiding when you avoid being alone? What truth waits for you in silence that noise keeps hidden? What part of your identity would collapse if external reinforcement stopped? The answers to these questions are not comfortable, but they are necessary, because without facing them, the self remains derivative. Leonardo's life does not romanticize solitude. It reveals its necessity, not as withdrawal from life, but as preparation for deeper engagement with it. The one who has faced himself in silence returns to the world with sharper perception, stronger independence, and less need to conform blindly. He is not detached, but he is not owned. And in that state, the human being finally begins to speak with a voice that is not borrowed, not echoed, and no longer afraid of standing alone. Chapter 8. Time reveals what desire tries to hide. Time is not a neutral passage. It is a force that exposes truth. Leonardo da Vinci did not treat time as something to be managed or defeated. He moved with it, observed it, studied it, and most importantly, endured it. Because time does something that talent alone cannot. It strips away illusion. It reveals whether what we build can survive duration or collapses under it. Before the modern world accelerated everything into urgency, before speed became a substitute for depth, Leonardo had already understood a harder principle. What is real does not fear time. What is false cannot withstand it. This is not poetic, it is structural. A weak idea fades. A superficial work loses its force. A shallow identity dissolves when it is no longer sustained by immediate attention. Time tests everything by extending it beyond the moment of excitement. Most people live in conflict with time. They rush, they compress, they try to extract results before the process has matured. Not because time is insufficient, but because patience is insufficient. They want clarity before confusion has been fully examined. They want completion before understanding has stabilized. They want recognition before substance has formed. This impatience produces fragile outcomes, things that appear strong in the moment but cannot endure. Leonardo resisted this impulse. He allowed time to participate in his work. He did not force resolution prematurely. He returned, revised, re-examined. He understood that perception changes over time, and what appears complete in one moment may reveal its weakness in another. This is why he revisited his works, sometimes over years, not because he was trapped, but because he knew the truth unfolds gradually. It cannot be seized instantly. This reveals the first dimension of time. Time deepens perception. The longer one remains with something, the more layers become visible. Details that were invisible begin to emerge. Relationships that were unclear begin to organize themselves. Contradictions appear. Patterns stabilize. The object reveals itself not all at once, but in stages. Leonardo's patience allowed him to follow this unfolding. He did not reduce reality to what could be seen immediately. He allowed it to reveal itself through duration. The second dimension is more severe. Time destroys what is built on illusion. A weak structure can survive for a moment. It can even impress. But extend it, and it collapses. This applies not only to works of art, but to identity itself. A person can maintain a false image for a period, but over time, inconsistency appears. Cracks form. The gap between appearance and reality widens. Leonardo's commitment to accuracy was partly a response to this truth. He was not interested in creating something that only worked at first glance. He wanted durability. He wanted coherence that could survive repeated observation. This leads to a difficult question. What in your life would remain if it were subjected to time? What would deepen and what would decay? If something only exists under immediate validation, it is already unstable. Time is the measure that cannot be manipulated. It reveals what is sustained by substance and what is sustained by attention. Leonardo chose to build for time, not for the moment. The modern world moves in the opposite direction. In 2025, immediacy dominates. Speed is rewarded. Visibility is constant. The present moment is stretched to its limit, while the future is treated as abstract and the past as irrelevant. This creates a distortion. People build for impact, not for endurance. They create for reaction, not for depth. And because of this, much of what is produced dissolves as quickly as it appears. Leonardo's example stands against this collapse. He reminds us that time is not the enemy of creation. It is its ally. It allows refinement. It allows correction. It allows the work to be tested against itself repeatedly. Without time, there is no depth, only surface. But this alliance requires sacrifice. To work with time is to accept slowness. It is to delay gratification. It is to remain in uncertainty longer than comfort allows. This is psychologically difficult because the human mind seeks closure. It wants to move on. It wants to declare something finished. But Leonardo resisted this impulse because he understood that premature closure is a form of escape. It avoids the deeper demands of the work. This reveals the third dimension of time. Time confronts the self. The longer one remains with a task, the more one encounters personal limitation, impatience, fatigue, doubt, distraction. These are not external obstacles, they are internal resistances. Time exposes them because it stretches the process beyond the initial burst of energy. Many people begin with intensity but cannot continue. They lack endurance. Leonardo's strength was not only in beginning, but in continuing. This continuity is what transforms effort into mastery. Repetition over time refines skill. Observation over time sharpens perception. Correction over time increases precision. Without duration, these processes cannot stabilize. They remain shallow. Leonardo's prolonged engagement with his work allowed these transformations to take place. He did not rely on momentary brilliance. He relied on sustained attention. There is also a philosophical dimension to this. Time reveals that becoming is more fundamental than being. Nothing is fixed. Everything is in process. A work evolves. A thought evolves. A self evolves. To deny time is to deny this process. It is to freeze reality into static images that no longer reflect its movement. Leonardo's work often captures this sense of becoming. His figures seem suspended between states. His forms suggest motion even in stillness. This reflects his understanding that reality is never complete. It is always unfolding. Through Leonardo as a symbolic figure, we see that time is not simply something that passes, it is something that works. It shapes, tests, refines, and exposes. It collaborates with the one who respects it and destroys the one who tries to bypass it. This is why impatience is not a minor flaw. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of how reality operates. The psychological resistance to time is rooted in fear. Fear that the effort will not succeed. Fear that the result will not justify the duration. Fear that one will be exposed as insufficient. These fears push the individual to rush, to finalize early, to avoid prolonged confrontation. But avoidance does not solve these fears. It hides them, and what is hidden remains unresolved. Leonardo did not hide. He stayed. He allowed time to reveal both the work and himself. This is the deeper meaning of endurance. It is not simply persistence. It is the willingness to remain in contact with truth as it unfolds, even when that unfolding is slow, uncertain, and demanding. This leads to a final recognition. Time is the ultimate filter. It removes what is weak and preserves what is strong. Not instantly, but inevitably. The question is not whether time will test what you create. It will. The question is whether what you create is built to survive that test. Leonardo's life offers a clear answer. Build slowly enough to see clearly. Stay long enough to understand deeply. Refine until what remains is no longer dependent on the moment. Because in the end, time does not negotiate. It only reveals. And what it reveals cannot be hidden again. Chapter 9. Failure is the exposure of false identity. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is the exposure of illusion. Leonardo da Vinci did not avoid failure, nor did he interpret it as a final verdict. He encountered it as revelation, because every failure strips away something that was never solid to begin with. It removes what the mind wanted to believe about itself and replaces it with what actually is. Before the modern world began hiding failure behind narratives of motivation, before it turned every collapse into a soft lesson designed to protect self-esteem, Leonardo had already entered a harsher understanding. Failure is not there to comfort you. It is there to confront you. It shows you exactly where your perception was weak, where your execution was imprecise, where your understanding was incomplete. It does not explain gently. It reveals directly. Most people misunderstand failure because they experience it only as interruption. Something goes wrong, and they feel blocked. They feel delayed. They feel denied. But this interpretation remains shallow. Failure is not simply an obstacle in the path. It is the path correcting itself. It is reality refusing to comply with your illusion. And that refusal is necessary. Without it, you would continue building on what is false. Leonardo's life is filled with unfinished works, abandoned projects, and experiments that did not achieve their intended result. But these are not signs of weakness. They are signs of confrontation. He did not protect himself from the evidence of limitation. He allowed the work to fail in front of him, and in that failure, something became visible. Not only about the work, but about his own capacity. This is the first dimension of failure. It reveals the gap between intention and ability. You believe you can do something. You attempt it. The result exposes the truth. This gap is where growth begins, but only if the individual does not retreat from it. Most people retreat. They either deny the failure or reinterpret it in a way that protects their identity. They say the conditions were wrong, The timing was wrong. The expectations were unfair. All of this may contain fragments of truth, but it avoids the deeper confrontation. Where exactly was I insufficient? Leonardo asked that question relentlessly. He did not allow failure to remain external. He brought it inward. He examined it. He used it as a tool of refinement. This is what separates failure that destroys from failure that transforms. The first is avoided or denied. The second is studied. The second dimension of failure is more severe. It exposes not only what you cannot do, but who you are pretending to be. Human beings construct identities around competence. They want to see themselves as capable, intelligent, in control. Failure threatens this construction. It introduces contradiction. It reveals that the image is incomplete or inflated. This is why failure is often experienced as humiliation. It is not just the work that collapses, it is the self-image. And this is where most people break. They cannot tolerate the collapse of identity. They would rather remain mediocre than confront the possibility that their self-understanding is inaccurate. Leonardo moved in the opposite direction. He allowed failure to reshape his identity. He did not cling to a fixed image of himself. He let his limitations inform his development. This requires a form of psychological courage that is rare. To face failure without immediately defending oneself is to stand exposed. To admit that your current level is insufficient is to abandon comfort. But without this abandonment, growth becomes impossible. You cannot improve what you refuse to see. The modern world complicates this further. In 2025, failure is often hidden, edited, or transformed into a narrative of quick recovery. The appearance of success is maintained even when the structure beneath it is weak. This creates a culture where failure is feared not because it reveals truth, but because it disrupts image. People are more concerned with how failure looks than with what it teaches. Leonardo's approach dismantles this concern. He was not building an image, he was building understanding. And understanding cannot be protected from failure. It must pass through it. Every mistake becomes data. Every collapse becomes information. Every unsuccessful attempt sharpens the next attempt. This is not optimism, it is method. The third dimension of failure is endurance. It tests whether the individual can continue after being exposed. Many can begin. Few can continue after their inadequacy has been revealed. Because continuation requires the ego to accept its own imperfection without withdrawing. It requires the individual to remain engaged with the work, even when confidence has been shaken. Leonardo's persistence shows that failure did not weaken his commitment. It clarified it. Each failed attempt narrowed the path. It removed what did not work. It forced him closer to what might work. This process is slow and often invisible, but it is the only way depth is achieved. There is also a philosophical shift that occurs when failure is understood correctly. Success is no longer the primary measure. Clarity becomes more important than outcome. The question changes from, "Did I succeed?" to "What did this reveal?" If failure reveals more than success, then it becomes more valuable. This reverses the usual hierarchy. It places truth above achievement. Through Leonardo as a symbolic figure, we see that failure is not an event to be avoided, but a condition to be used. It is the mechanism through which illusion is removed. It is the pressure that forces the self to become more precise, more disciplined, more honest. Without it, development stagnates. With it, development accelerates. This leads to a final confrontation. What part of your identity depends on not failing? What belief about yourself would collapse if failure were fully admitted? What are you protecting when you avoid situations where failure is possible? These questions are not comfortable, but they reveal the boundary of your current growth. Leonardo crossed that boundary repeatedly, not because he was fearless, but because he valued truth more than comfort. He accepted that failure would accompany any serious attempt to understand or create. He did not interpret it as a signal to stop. He interpreted it as a signal to look again. And in that act of looking again, failure loses its power to define and becomes a force that refines. Chapter 10. The self becomes real only when it stops escaping. A human being does not become real by discovering himself. He becomes real by refusing to escape himself. Leonardo da Vinci did not reach the depth of his existence through comfort, recognition, or completion. He reached it through continuous confrontation with what remained unresolved, unfinished, and uncertain within him. This is where the final truth stands, not as a conclusion, but as a demand. Before the modern world turned self-realization into a soft narrative of fulfillment, before it promised that meaning could be found through ease, balance, and affirmation, Leonardo had already stepped into a harsher terrain. To become oneself is not to arrive at clarity and rest. It is to remain in tension with one's own potential. It is to refuse every premature closure that would reduce the self to something fixed and safe. Most people misunderstand identity. They treat it as something to define, stabilize, and protect. They want a clear answer to the question of who they are. They want that answer to remain consistent. They want it to be recognized and confirmed by others. But this desire is rooted in fear. The fear of instability, the fear of contradiction, the fear of becoming something they cannot predict or control. Leonardo did not seek that kind of stability. He allowed himself to remain in motion, not chaotic motion, but structured transformation. He did not reduce himself to a single role, a single discipline, a single definition. He expanded, crossed boundaries, revisited his own understanding, and refused to let earlier versions of himself become final. This is what makes his life philosophically significant. It shows that identity is not a fixed object. It is an ongoing act. This act is not easy. It requires the individual to face the fact that he is never complete, that every achievement reveals new insufficiency, that every clarity opens new uncertainty. This is not failure. This is the structure of becoming. But to accept this structure is to abandon the comfort of final identity. It is to live without the illusion that one has already arrived. The modern world resists this deeply. In 2025, identity is constantly constructed, displayed, and reinforced through external systems. People define themselves through roles, affiliations, achievements, and images. These definitions provide temporary stability, but they also limit growth. Once a person commits to an identity, he begins to defend it. He avoids situations that would contradict it. He filters experience to preserve it, and in doing so, he stops evolving. Leonardo avoided this trap because he did not treat identity as something to defend. He treated it as something to test. He allowed himself to enter unfamiliar domains, to question his own methods, to revise his own conclusions. This required a form of inner flexibility that most people lack. Because flexibility threatens certainty, and certainty is what the ego depends on. This is where the deeper conflict emerges. The self wants to grow, but it also wants to remain secure. Growth requires exposure, uncertainty, and change. Security requires stability, predictability, and control. These two forces pull in opposite directions. Most people resolve this conflict by choosing security. They stabilize their identity and limit their growth. Leonardo chose differently. He accepted instability as the cost of expansion. This acceptance transforms the meaning of life itself. Life is no longer a path toward a fixed state of completion. It becomes a continuous process of refinement. Each stage is provisional. Each understanding is partial. Each identity is temporary. This does not make life meaningless. It makes it dynamic. It places responsibility on the individual to remain engaged, to continue questioning, to resist stagnation. There is also a psychological depth to this process. The self is not a unified entity. It contains contradictions, impulses, fears, and potentials that do not align easily. To become real is not to eliminate these contradictions, but to confront them, to see them clearly, to integrate what can be integrated, and to endure what cannot. Leonardo's work reflects this complexity. His figures often appear calm on the surface, but carry tension beneath. This is not accidental. It mirrors the structure of the human condition. Through Leonardo as a symbolic figure, we see that authenticity is not simplicity. It is complexity faced without avoidance. It is the willingness to see oneself without distortion, to recognize both strength and limitation, to accept that clarity is always partial. This is why self-knowledge is never finished. It deepens over time, but it never closes. This leads to a final confrontation. What are you avoiding in yourself? What part of your potential remains unrealized because you refuse to leave your current identity? What truth about yourself would force you to change if you fully accepted it? These questions are not abstract. They define the boundary between stagnation and growth. Leonardo crossed that boundary repeatedly, not because he had no fear, but because he did not allow fear to define his limits. He did not wait for certainty before acting. He acted within uncertainty. He did not demand clarity before moving forward. He allowed clarity to emerge through movement. This is the essence of becoming, not waiting for the path to be visible, but creating the path through engagement. The final lesson is severe. There is no moment where the self is complete. There is no final version that resolves all tension. There is only the ongoing process of becoming more aligned with what is true. This process requires honesty, discipline, and courage. It cannot be outsourced. It cannot be accelerated artificially. It must be lived. And this is where everything converges. The marginal beginning, the relentless curiosity, the discipline of the workshop, the transformation of art into thought, the pursuit of perfection, the unity of knowledge, the necessity of solitude, the endurance of time, the confrontation with failure. All of these are not separate themes. They are expressions of one underlying movement, the refusal to remain false. Leonardo's life does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. It shows that the self becomes real only when it stops escaping into illusion, into convenience, into fixed identity. It shows that truth is not given, but built through continuous confrontation with reality. And at the point where escape ends, becoming begins, and there is no return to who you were before. A human life is not measured by what it completes, but by what it dares to confront. Leonardo da Vinci does not stand before us as a finished monument, but as a force that refuses closure. His life does not offer a comfortable narrative of success. It offers a demand to see more, to think deeper, to refuse the limits that society quietly installs inside us. He reveals that a human being is not a fixed identity, not a title, not a role to be repeated until death. He reveals that existence is movement, to feel, to observe, to question, to create, to fail, to begin again. This is not excess. This is the only way consciousness remains alive. The moment we stop asking, we begin to decay. The moment we accept what is given without resistance, we become smaller than what we could be. Before the world learned to celebrate specialization and safety, he had already stepped beyond both. He crossed disciplines not to impress, but because reality itself is not divided. He refused completion, not out of weakness, but because truth kept expanding. He remained restless, not because he lacked direction, but because direction itself kept evolving under his gaze. And now the question turns toward you. What are you settling for because it is easier than confronting your own depth? What part of your life is already finished, not because it is complete, but because you stopped pushing it further? What truth are you avoiding because it would demand that you change? Leonardo's life leaves no space for comfort. It strips away the illusion that we are here to fit neatly into predefined forms. It shows that to live fully is to exist in tension between knowledge and mystery, between structure and freedom, between what you are and what you have not yet become. He did not leave behind answers. He left behind a direction that points inward and outward at the same time, inward toward the unfinished self, outward toward a world that still hides more than it reveals. And at the point where you stop asking for certainty and start demanding truth, you realize that the purpose of a human life is not to arrive, but to expand until nothing false can remain.